Okay, well, good morning, and thank you everybody for joining us for the first of two in our session on socially distanced high holidays. We're going to talk Rosh HaShanah today as the worst day for social distancing, although we'll see it's a little more nuanced than that. I hope everybody had a good August. I hope people are healthy, and God willing that should continue. For those who had any difficulty registering, I apologize. The link for registering is torontotorah.com/distanced. If you're joining the session but have not registered, which you'll know if you didn't get the email that I sent out with the source sheet, then you might want to go to the website to be able to, I'm going to put in the link for it in the chat, in order to register and in order to then get the emails both before class with the source sheet and after class with the follow-up link and so on from the class. That also enables people to pay for the class, although if it's a hardship, please just participate anyway. But there is a $10 per session fee for the series. The source sheet is downloadable for those who did not receive it by email. Note, if you're using Simpatico, if your email address is simpatico.ca, they're still blocking group emails, so you won't be getting the email updates unless you can give me a different email address, but I put the link in the chat for downloading the source sheet. During the session, those who have participated before know, my preference is for comments and questions to be made aloud verbally within the session as opposed to in the chat. I find monitoring the chat and the discussion to be distracting. So if you're able to ask the questions in the session, I actually prefer that. Okay, so let's get started. And I want to begin with the source that I put at the top of the source sheet. And I'm going to share this because I know not everybody has it. So I'm actually going to share the screen with this just for this source. Normally I don't like sharing the screen. I like to see people. But in this case, I'll share it just to make sure that everybody can read this. This comes from an article that I saw ages ago by a woman named Maureen Adler Marks. The article is called Boomer Rejuvenation, R-E-J-E-W. And she writes, "When I was growing up in New York, my favorite Rosh HaShanah ritual was the purchase of a new Jewish suit. Despite the threat of Indian summer heat, year after year I'd be in shul, sweltering in blue wool, dripping with sweat and pride, duped by seasonal change again. In Los Angeles now, of course, we're laid back. New clothing merely means a new black cotton t-shirt. The other day at Torah study, we discussed the controversy of Jewish jeans. Is it all right to wear denims and running shoes to services? Whatever, shrugged the well-dressed rabbi, dapper in Armani. But with the growing influence of the ashram and the recent adoption of meditation-style worship, it's only a matter of time until our clothing goes with the flow." Does this sound familiar? This description that she gives of the Rosh Hashanah ritual of the purchase of a new suit to wear to shul. Does that ring a bell?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. I definitely remember in growing up in Oceanside, Long Island, in New York, and we would go to Schwatzky's, and they would size us up, and it was not exactly my favorite thing to do. She describes it as something that brought on pride, which I'm envious of. That wasn't my favorite Rosh Hashanah ritual. My favorite Rosh Hashanah ritual was, generally speaking, when you'd be running home, at some point following services, and you'd fall and skin your knee and make a hole in the suit. That was usually my Rosh Hashanah ritual. Nonetheless, the description that she gives here is certainly familiar of the purchase of the new suit for Rosh Hashanah and what some call the Rosh Hashanah fashion show. The idea that when you are in synagogue, you look a certain way, you not so much show off, because that has very negative connotations, but there's sort of this sense of admiring what everybody has and their finery for Rosh Hashanah. Where does that come from? Why is that a thing? On a day that's the day of judgment before God, why is the fashion show part of the scene? What would you say?
I don't think it's a fashion show. I think it's respect for the services and for the shul and for whoever's there. I don't look at it as fashion.
So respect for the services is a very important part for sure. And I think that's really the point that this writer is making, Maureen Adler-Marks. She's really focused on the question of what the clothing says about your approach to the services. And when you look at her full article, which of course I didn't bring on the source sheet, you actually see much more about that. And she talks about how having restrictive clothing can actually be a very good thing when trying to get in the frame of mind for repentance. That's her.
Would it be potentially that you're dressing for the king, like all of the king imagery for Rosh Hashanah? So right. You're coming to the palace, you're dressing for the king.
Right. So Nanette makes certainly that, building on what Marilyn said, that it's about the respect for God and respect, I think, for Rosh Hashanah and all of its themes. And I would hope that that is part of it. But I do think that for many people, part of the high holidays, including being in shul, being in the synagogue, is seeing people you haven't seen for a long time. And that definitely brings about a clothing-related self-consciousness. We're going to see more about hang on one second.
It's also celebratory.
There is a celebratory element. That's what I was actually about to say, that we're going to see later. There's another element, the joy element, that we're also going to talk about. So yes, that's going to come into play in this also. Diane, what were you going to say?
Well, we get it at Matan Torah. Matan Torah, aren't we commanded to something to do with our clothing at Matan Torah at Sinai?
So there was the practice of washing clothing before we received the Torah at Sinai. Chibsusim lotam. The question is whether that's about cleanliness or about purification. That's another issue. I'm going to mute everybody by default, by the way, just for a moment. Everyone is still able to unmute themselves to ask questions and make comments, but just to avoid background noise, I think that may be helpful. Yes, Esther.
So what about, like, on Rosh Chodesh, women anyway are supposed to get new clothes. So this is like an amplified Rosh Chodesh, right? You're starting the year, your outfit is for the year. I don't know if it's really, I don't think at this stage that for many people is to impress the person next to them. I think it's to renew it's part of the renewal. Good.
So there's a whole other element to why one might have new clothing for the holiday. We actually had a mini-series at Beth Emeth about 6 or 7 years ago called Jews and Clothes, in which we talked about this issue of new clothes for the holidays and the joy of new clothing. Some of that applies to Rosh Hashanah, some of it doesn't, meaning there is a mitzvah of v'samachta b'chagecha, that you're supposed to rejoice on your holiday. And as the Talmud explains, that's for Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot, for the big three, in particular, a man is supposed to make sure that his wife receives new clothing appropriate for the season. That will help bring her joy. Why is it that the wife gets the new clothing? What is it the husband is getting? That's a great discussion for another time. That doesn't actually have a Rosh Hashanah application. What may have a Rosh Hashanah application, though, is a practice that stems from a legal debate. And this is going to take us a little bit afield, but it's worth noting. Do people here have the practice of having a new fruit the second night of Rosh Hashanah? Right, that's familiar. So the origin of that practice of the new fruit is because there's a debate, a technical debate in the Talmud. Do we view the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah as one long day or as 2 separate days? With the following practical application, When I make Kiddush on the first night of Rosh Hashanah, I say a blessing of Shehachianu, thanking God for bringing us to this date. It's what you do for a one-shot event. This event, which happens once a year, brings us a certain joy. And so you make this blessing of Shehachianu. If Rosh Hashanah is 2 separate days, then each day warrants its own Shehachianu. And therefore you do it again the next night. But if it's one long day, then there's no Shehachianu the second night. You shouldn't be making the blessing. So some have the practice of having a food that they haven't had in the since it was in season last time, and that brings a certain joy, and therefore you warrant this blessing of Shehachianu. And others will say, I'll take a new piece of clothing, something that brings me joy for that. The truth is, even if you don't have the new fruit and you don't have the new clothing, you still make the blessing in Kiddush. But that's where that comes from, and it's another reason, Esther, for having new clothing, separate from all the other good reasons that have been given. We've now talked about having finery for respect for the day. We've talked about it in terms of the joy element, and I'm going to come back to that. We now see that there are ritual reasons for having new clothing as well. All of these are valid, but I don't want to get rid of the fashion show idea so fast. Because the idea of being in the synagogue on Rosh Hashanah, Susan, I see your hand. Hang on one second. Thank you. The idea of being in shul on Rosh Hashanah among all of these people who you haven't seen in a while, who you're looking forward to actually seeing there and mixing with, is a real issue for people on Rosh Hashanah. It's a thing. When I was a synagogue rabbi, so there were always certain seating tensions that came up Rosh Hashanah time, right? And again, this year, this is one of those things that's just been blown to bits. But I want to be next to this person because I've been next to them on the high holidays for 40 years. I would prefer not to be next to that person, on the other hand, because I've been next to them for 40 years. There were always preferences that certain people had about whom they wanted to be with, jockeying for space for adult children who are visiting from out of town. This is a constant. It's the Rosh Hashanah experience in shul for many people is about those who are around them and the people they are with. And whether that's why they dress up or not why they dress up isn't really the point. I just bring that as a key element of what can be a very social event, because the question I'm going to ask, and then I'm going to come back to Susan, is this Rosh Hashanah, families who are used to being together for services, being together for meals, are going to need to be separate. People who are used to going to the synagogue may not feel safe there. And even if they are there, they're not going to have the option of sitting close to old friends. Services in many synagogues are going to be quick to minimize the time that people are together in an enclosed space, or to allow the synagogue to hold multiple services that are staggered one after the other. And so the question is going to be, what does this do to our Rosh Hashanah? How should we deal with that? That's really where I want to go with our conversation. I'm going to take Susan's question, and then I'm going to move on in terms of addressing this. So Susan, go ahead, please.
Well, everyone's talking very nicely, but I know of people who are very upset at Rosh Hashanah because I don't have the quote, I'm not saying me personally, have the money to buy a nice outfit. And what are the people going to say? People are talking, it's all for God, but the kind of clothes some people wear are very expensive. And you do hear, I don't say the men because I don't know what the men say, but you hear, oh, look what she's wearing. Look at that hat or whatever. It is, and there is a tension. And yes, it's all nice to do it for God and we're all these things, but there is a pressure. Do I have the right outfit? Maybe not for men, I don't know. But definitely for women, and we're ignoring that. Well, people are all saying these lovely things, but there's also, not everybody can buy beautiful clothes, and not everybody dresses or has the money or whatever. And there is a pressure in that as well. And
yeah, you are quite right, and thank you for raising the point. There's a great tension in the Talmud between two principles. On the one hand, we have a principle which has an effect in Jewish law called Chas HaKadosh Baruch Hu al Mamonan Shel Yisrael, that God spares or has mercy on the assets of Israel, meaning that there are certain laws that God created which could have been more expensive to carry out. And God said, no, I don't want to create a situation in which it's difficult for people. And therefore, I'm going to make things less expensive. Granted that, there are very expensive practices in Judaism, right? Think shopping for Pesach food. Nonetheless, it could have been worse. And specifically, God said, I don't want it to be worse. So I'll give you one example. There is a law on the books, which I don't want to get into in great depth, about a situation in which a person's house becomes impure. The Kohen comes to look at it, identifies it as being impure, and at that point, everything in the house becomes impure, and therefore is ruined. And the rule that the Torah states is that when the Kohen comes to look at the house, he first instructs them, take everything out of the house so that if I declare it impure, your stuff will be safe. There's a concern that the Torah has to make sure that people shouldn't lose what they have, because there is a concern about those in need. And there are many examples of this in the Torah, and there's a rule in Jewish law that in a case of hefsed, in a case of financial loss, there are certain leniencies that can be taken in order to avoid that. That's on the one hand. That's one principle. On the other hand, there's an opposite principle. When you deal with the Beit HaMikdash, the temple in Jerusalem, there's a principle of ein aniyut b'makom ashirut. There is no such thing as poverty in the place of wealth. And therefore, the Beit HaMikdash, the temple in Jerusalem, is supposed to be outfitted with the best stuff. And it's a balance, because that's expensive to do, and the community has to pay for it. So I absolutely recognize the downside to the dressing up. And the question then becomes, so do you tell everybody to not dress up in order to preserve the dignity of those who can't afford it? Do you say, let's raise funds and distribute, and that way everybody will have, those who want to receive, and those who are not insulted by being given a handout? Right? I mean, these are complicated social problems. It's not straightforward. I see Marilyn has her hand up. So I'm going to take Marilyn's comment and move on. But you're right. This is not, we haven't resolved this. This is an issue. Marilyn, I see Barbara also. So Marilyn, you have to unmute. I can't hear you.
I disagree that we, at certainly whatever age you are impressed with clothing. Obviously, clothing reflect who you are. But on this day of all days, we shouldn't be judging. And being impressed by clothing is a form of judgment. We're there to pray for forgiveness. I don't think we should, in respectful way, judging what people are wearing or not wearing. They're in shul. And it's very nice to look good and all those things. But I disagree that we all say, oh, look what she's wearing. I haven't heard that expression since I was a child. So I had to say that.
Marilyn, you travel in great circles. That's
I hope so.
I think that's the way it is. But also I would note, and this is reality, even if no one is judging, people still feel bad and judge themselves. You know,
that's true. That's true.
You know, that's reality. Insecurity, self-consciousness, it's part of being a human being. So I want to move on from that. This is the danger of a really good ice-breaking source. Is that you end up talking only about that, and we have a lot more to talk through. So I think what I want to do at this point is note the opposite. I've emphasized Rosh HaShanah as a very social day. And that's a theme that I want to come back to, but I should note, you could make the argument that Rosh Hashanah is a day for distancing. First of all, consider the theme of the day. The theme of the day is judgment, right? The theme of the day is not just Happy New Year. It's God actually assessing what a person has been doing. Now, Rosh Hashanah as a day of judgment really requires its own discussion because it's a very uncomfortable theme in an era of relativism, non-judgmentalism, validating people while still making judgments about their conduct is really challenging. However, according to the Torah and according to Judaism, God does exactly that. Meaning, God recognizes each person's value, each person's circumstances, what made them do what they did. All of that is recognized at the same time that God makes assessments of what they've done with their time and their resources. God is both validating and judging. And that's what's happening on Rosh HaShanah. And because of that judgment, Rosh HaShanah does have an isolating component. I'm going to refer you to a passage in the Talmud, which is on source number 2 in the sheet. I'm going to share the sheet again in the chat. I gave you the link for those who have not yet downloaded, but I will share the screen briefly in order to show this source together. It's source number 2 from the Talmud in Rosh Hashanah. Remember that the Talmud is constructed of 2 layers of text. First, the Mishnah, the earlier outline of Jewish law, which existed for a very, very long time, but was finally written down in the 3rd century Common Era, and then the expansion of it of the Gemara. So the Talmud here first brings a Mishnah, which says, on Rosh Hashanah, the first day of the month of Tishrei, all who have entered this world pass before God like what are called B'nai Maron. So the Talmud asks, what does that mean, this phrase that we are like B'nai Maron? What exactly is that about? And it gives 3 different explanations. By the way, you may recall, this idea of passing before God like B'nai Maron is in the Unetana Tokef. That's in the liturgy for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So, the Talmud says, in Babylon they explained, like B'nai Imrana. Being like B'nai Maron means like B'nai Imrana. What does B'nai Imrana mean? It means sheep. What is it about sheep? When they tithe the sheep, annually you separate 10% of the sheep born in that year as a tithe. When they tithe them, they pass them one by one through a corridor. That's the idea of B'nai Maron. We are like sheep being passed for judgment one by one. Reish Lakish, a sage from, I think he is 5th century, said, like the narrow steps of Beit Maron, there was a place in which you had to walk single file down or up the incline, and it's the place with very narrow steps. Rabbi Yehuda quoted Shmuel. He said, no, Maron is like Maran, our master. It's like the soldiers of the house of King David. In each of the explanations that is offered here, B'nai Maron is used to refer to each person being judged individually. Each one of us, one by one, with God. Even though our impact on others is weighed when we are assessed by God, nonetheless, we have to stand or fall, God forbid, on our own merits. It's a solo experience being judged. You follow? That's what the Talmud is trying to teach. And in fact, we address the judgment with solo activities, right? We pray, hopefully together as a community, again, if it's safe this year, but the prayers are fundamentally personal. They're reflective. They're silent. In the Haftorah, the Haftorah reading for the first day of Rosh Hashanah, whose story do we read? I can't hear. People are muted. I see lips moving.
Hannah.
Abraham and Isaac.
So Abraham and Isaac in the Torah reading of the second day, good. A little bit on the first day also, actually. But the Haftorah on the first day is the story of Hannah, who goes to pray for a child, and she prays at the Mishkan, at the tabernacle on her own, and she prays in silence. And the Talmud in source number 3, I'm not going to share the sheet at this point to save time, but you have it on your sheet. The Talmud says we learn very valuable lessons about prayer, laws, in fact, that govern our prayer, from Hannah's prayer. For one thing, it says she spoke upon her heart. We understand from there the importance that you have to feel what you're saying. You have to be focused and you concentrate. Also, it says her lips moved. From that, we understand that you're supposed to actually form the words with your lips. It's not enough to scan them with your eyes. And it says her voice was not heard. From that, we understand that you don't elevate your voice when you pray. It's a personal, private, silent experience. There's a lot to be said about the value of silent prayer versus the value of prayer out loud. And the truth is, I've taught classes on that, but it's not going to be for right now. And I'm skipping my source number 4, which is a nice source, which is worth discussing at some point, but I'm not going to bring it to bear right now. But it shows that, in fact, distancing can be part of the day. I see you, Susan. Hang on. The distancing can be part of the Rosh Hashanah experience. We do pray silently. I'm going to come back to the fact, of course, that we try to pray with others in a minyan. That's going to be part of this as well. Susan, what were you going to say?
Then why do we have, when we have chazans, they're very loud, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, but it's just the opposite of what you're saying.
Right. So there's a lot to be said about chazanim. And I'm going to not say it because it's already 10:27. But there's a lot to be said about the chazan and the role of the chazan and the loud chazan and the cantorial chazan and all of that. You know, there's a long history.
Actually, the shliach tzibur.
Yeah. But there's a long history in rabbinic writing in which rabbis and chazanim are not on the same page. They because of some of that. It's really important to have a chazan shliach tzibur, as Ruchama notes, but how it's done is actually a whole other discussion, a good discussion, but I'm not going to digress right now. Another of the solo activities that we take part in on Rosh Hashanah is what's called cheshbon hanefesh, an accounting of ourselves. I brought you a source on the sheet from Dr. Pat Crosscarry from Dalhousie. He talks about the importance, I'm not going to read it aloud. He talks about the importance for doctors. If a doctor makes a mistake, then afterwards it's really important for the doctor to do what he calls a cognitive and affective root cause analysis. Meaning, you go back and try to analyze the chain of behaviors that led to the mistake. And you look at what was the thought process, what was the mood, the state of mind. How is it that that happened in order to avoid repeating it? And in Judaism, we are called upon to do this cheshbon hanefesh, this personal accounting, in which we ask, what have I done? That's a key thing to do. Rosh Hashanah is not a day for prayers for forgiveness, interestingly. That comes after Rosh Hashanah. Before Rosh Hashanah, slichot, and after Rosh Hashanah as well. But on Rosh Hashanah, it's important that we do an analysis of where we've been, what we've done. I happen to like Dr. Crosscarry's formulation, but the truth is that there's all sorts of Jewish literature on doing this personal accounting. Another element of Rosh Hashanah that's very significant and that also is isolating is a lack of frivolity, a lack of lightheadedness. Now here I'm going to bring you a source that I absolutely love. Sorry, Diane, what?
I thought lightheartedness or lightheadedness?
Well, both. Let's call it both. But I'm going to share the source sheet here because I so love this source. This is a story from Rabbi Dr. Abraham Torczyner. So it picks up in the middle of a story. It's from a book called Positive Parenting. If you ever want to feel bad about yourself as a parent, so pick this up and read about all the things that you wish you had known before you started parenting. This is a phenomenal story about his father. And in context, he's not talking about Rosh Hashanah at all. In context, he's talking about how you discipline a child. Excuse me. And the story I bring you in midway, was that in their home, when Rabbi Dr. Torczyner was growing up, they often had, for those who aren't familiar, by the way, he's a prominent psychiatrist, especially in the area of addictions counseling. He has written dozens and dozens of books. He is phenomenal. Anytime you have a chance to hear him, watch him in a video online or read his writing, do it. He's fantastic. So in this story, he's talking about how the family used to host on various occasions people who are traveling through the area. And this particular Rosh Hashanah, there's a rabbi who's staying with them who offered Rabbi Dr. Torczyner, who was then a young kid, a chance to play chess. Apparently, Rabbi Dr. Twersky was very good at chess as a kid, and he used to play with the guests. So on Rosh Hashanah afternoon, this guest offers to play chess with him. And he plays chess, and his father finds out. And his father says to him to come see him. Tells one of his siblings, or whoever it was, tells him that he should come see him in his study. So he picks up here in source number 6. When I entered his study, he was engrossed in a sefer, a Torah text. And I stood by, respectfully silent, awaiting his recognition. After a few moments, he looked up and said softly, "You played chess on Yom Tov?" "Yes," I said. Rabbi C., the visitor, said it was allowed. My father said nothing. He returned his gaze to the sefer and slowly, barely perceptibly, shook his head in the negative. The message was clear. Even if technically not forbidden, it was not in the spirit of Rosh Hashanah to play games. I felt terrible. I had desecrated the holy day. I remained standing respectfully, waiting to be dismissed, digesting the reprimand I had received. Then my father looked up with a twinkle in his eye and said, "But you did checkmate him, didn't you?" "Twice," I said, softly but happily. So I love the story for what it says about parenting. And it's the sort of lesson I wish I had internalized better over the years, but I'm still trying. But the point that I bring from this story here is frivolity is inappropriate. Now, it's got to be age appropriate. It has to be appropriate for the child. It has to be appropriate for the adult. Meaning, there are some people for whom it's absolutely impossible to get through the day with that level of intensity. And for children, if they're not able to handle it, it can be destructive to try to impose that. You have to know your child. You have to know yourself. You have to know what your abilities are. You have to know what your options are. There are different types of frivolity, as it were. To one person, chess may be frivolous. To another person, chess is actually an achievement. And if it's not chess, it's going to be comic books. So you have to ask yourself, what is appropriate for me on this day? I bring the story not to establish, here's the rule for Rosh Hashanah, but to show the kind of mood we're talking about, which again sounds like a distancing type of mood. Don't hang out with other people. As a matter of fact, I brought you in source number 7 on the sheet that historically there have been some people who fasted on Rosh Hashanah. It's not our practice, but there have been some who fasted on Rosh Hashanah. There's a lot to be said about fasting on Rosh Hashanah, also beyond the scope of what we're talking about right now. But what I'm trying to show you is that Rosh Hashanah can be a day for distancing, even though people are used to having it as a get-together day. The theme of judgment really overshadows social involvement. But it's not only about judgment. Consider the history. When was the first Rosh Hashanah observed? When was the first Rosh Hashanah? Marilyn, you're muted.
I said a trick question. I can't think.
When God made the world.
Yeah, when God made the world, the very first Rosh Hashanah. But which day of creation was it?
We had to create humans.
Yeah. So it's
We had
day
to be
6.
humans.
6th day.
Day 6. That's always the trick, because one of the Rosh Hashanah prayers, classically, Hayom Haras Olam, today is the conception of the world, makes it sound like it's like day 1. But it's not. It's day 6. A day on which human beings are just with God. Human beings are just with Hashem. So to a certain extent, we should observe the day as a day to be alone with God, to recall that very first Rosh Hashanah. Not only that, think about the role models that are given to us in the Torah reading. On Rosh Hashanah, we read about, on the first day, Sarah, who is answered by God with a child. Hagar, who is answered by God when she runs away with, she actually runs away twice, but she is answered by God and her son Yishmael is saved. The Akedah, the binding of Isaac, in which Avraham and Yitzchak face their tests with God. In the Haftarah, we have the story of Hannah. These are all stories of individuals. and their challenges with God. Contrast that with Yom Kippur, in which the Torah reading is about the communal service in the temple. On Rosh Hashanah, you could argue the theme really is a solo theme. So right now, what I've just done is to say that Rosh Hashanah, you could argue, is a day for distancing. By the way, in source number 8, I gave you the list of the Torah readings, just so that you'll be able to see that there. I went through that a little bit quickly. But that's on the one hand. But despite everything I just outlined, Rosh Hashanah is a communal day. It is a festive day. And I'm going to turn your attention to source number 9 on the source sheet, a passage out of the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, and I'm going to share the screen for this because I think it's very important to make sure that everyone sees this source. Source number 9, under where I wrote down with distancing. Rabbi Chama, son of Rabbi Chanina, and Rabbi Hoshaya had a discussion. One of them said the following: what nation is like this one? Right? Mi kamcha Yisrael, who is like the Jews? Normally, someone who knows he's being judged will wear black, cloak himself in black, grow his beard long. He doesn't know how his verdict will emerge. But Israel is not like this. Rather, they wear white, cloak themselves in white, trim their beards, and eat, drink, and rejoice, knowing that God will perform miracles for them. So even though we're told this is a serious day, it's a day of judgment, it's a day of prayer, it's a day when you're not supposed to be frivolous, that's not the depiction of Rosh Hashanah. He says, look, we are wearing white, the idea of white being joy, the kittel being a joyous garment. You groom yourself nicely, you have nice meals, you expect that God is actually going to take care of us. Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik explained, the joy of Rosh Hashanah is because we have an audience with God. It may be intimidating to be judged, but it's enriching to feel that there is a judge who cares. That's where the joy comes from. The fact that I know I have an audience with God. It's actually supposed to have a happy aspect to it, not a fearful aspect. Not only that, as was noted before, we pray in a community. It's even though the prayer is silent and solo. Nonetheless, we are taught that we are supposed to pray before God as a community. So much so, I'm going to go back to the source sheet here to show this to you. If you take a look at source number 12, number 11 is a passage from the Talmud. Number 10 was Rabbi Soloveitchik, who I quoted, about the joy of being before God. The number 11 is a passage from the Talmud talking about how prayers that are communal are more desirable to God when everybody gets together. But I wanted to highlight for you source number 12. Every day, we bring something called ketoret, incense, in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple. It's a daily ritual. So the incense, this ketoret, has multiple ingredients. One of the ingredients is called chelbana, galbanum. And the Talmud writes, that has a bad smell. Galbanum is not the sort of thing you enjoy. So look what the Talmud says here. Any feast which does not, I'm sorry, it shouldn't say feast, that's my typo. That's a fun typo. Any fast which does not include some of the sinners of Israel is not a fast, meaning everyone has to repent together. If you create a minyan of people, a quorum of people that are all wonderful, they're all righteous, they haven't made any mistakes, they're all people with good track records, that's not appropriate. The fast has to include people who have mistakes on their record. Otherwise, it doesn't count. How do you know? Because galbanum, this ingredient in the incense, smells bad. And yet the text lists it among the spices of incense. And Abaye brings a lesson from the Talmud to support that idea. But what the Talmud is saying is that if we intend to come before God, we better do it as a community with everybody repenting together. Everybody approaching God as one. So Rosh Hashanah is supposed to be a social day. We have the aspect of joy, despite the solemnity. We have the aspect of prayer in the community, despite the fact that the solo prayer is silent. And not only that, we have meals. This is the feasting part. And I'm going to go back to the screen again, just asking people, does everyone have the source sheet so I don't need to keep sharing the screen?
Yes,
I have it.
yes.
I got a lot of yeses, but I have some no's. Rose says no. I have some yeses and I've got some no's. All right, so I'm gonna share this because I really want to make sure people see this source. It's a crucial one. If you take a look at source number 13, this is from the book of Nehemiah. Etta, you heard this already when you were at my class last Wednesday night. But bear with me anyway. This is a story from the Second Temple period. The Jews who had come back to build the temple in Jerusalem and to resettle the land, they had come back from their exile under Babylonians and the Persians, heard a public Torah reading on the day of Rosh Hashanah. It's on the first day of the 7th month, the day of Rosh Hashanah, and they start crying when they hear the Torah read. As commentators explain, they understand it's a day of judgment, and they know they haven't lived up to what they're supposed to be. And so then you get this passage here in source number 13 from Nehemiah, chapter 8. And Nehemiah the governor, and Ezra the Kohen, the scribe, or sofer, as it actually says in the Hebrew. Sofer is not only scribe, it's a bigger term. But Ezra, Nehemiah, the Levites who made the nation understand, who taught the nation, they told the entire nation, today is sacred to Hashem your God. Do not mourn, do not cry. For the entire nation cried when they heard the words of the Torah. He said, no, don't cry. And he told them, go eat rich foods and drink sweet drinks and send portions to those who do not have any ready. For today is sacred for our master. Be not sad, for joy in God is your strength. And the Levites silenced the nation, saying, be still, for today is sacred. Be not sad. And the entire nation went to eat and drink and to send portions to make a great rejoicing, for they understood that which had been told to them. So what you see here in this message of Nehemiah is a pep talk. For the Jews who are weeping, he says, no, don't weep, don't cry. Have big feasts. Ichlu mashmanim, shisu mamtakim. Eat rich foods, drink sweet drinks, celebrate on Rosh Hashanah. We're celebrating the proximity to God, the fact that God cares about what we do, as Rabbi Soloveitchik said before. Not only that, it leads to a very interesting law, which may not be familiar. Anyone familiar with the law of Oto ve'et beno? Etta, you can't say because you were at the class where I talked about this last week. Oto ve'et beno, or oso ve'es beno for Ashkenazim. Okay, so the Torah says, V'shor oseh, oto ve'et beno lo tishchatu b'yom echad. If you have an ox, if you have a sheep, don't shecht the animal and its young on the same day.
This reminds also the Kantipor.
That's a separate one, but that is a law also. But this one in particular. The rule is that we have to make sure that an animal and its young are not shechted on the same day, and specifically the mother and the young are not slaughtered on the same day. Not only by the same person, even by two different people. So if I slaughter the mother and then somebody else slaughters the calf, that's a violation of the law. Well, that can create a problem, because what if I sell an animal and I own the parent or the young? I apologize to the vegetarians, but this is a law in the books. If I slaughter mine, the other person could be in violation if they slaughter the one they bought off of me on the same day. So the Talmud writes, and it's the Mishnah I brought in source number 14, that at times of year when people normally eat a lot of meat, You have to inform the person, if you sell them the animal, that you are planning on slaughtering the mother or the young to avoid a problem. You have to coordinate. When are the times of year that are times when people eat a lot of meat? So source number 14 says, it's a Mishnah, the 7th day of Sukkot is one. The day before, meaning because they're going to have Shmini Atzeret, this big celebration that's coming. The day before Pesach, logical. The day before Shavuot, all you blintzes eaters, they're eating meat. And the day before Rosh HaShanah, as well as the day before Yom Kippur in the Galil, in northern Israel, they also did it then. My point in bringing this source is to show you that Rosh Hashanah was considered a time of making a big feast. They were not sitting there shuddering, scared. They were feasting like Nehemiah had advised. So Rosh Hashanah is a day of, number one, a festive mood. Number two, it's a day to pray as a community. And number three, it's a day for a big feast. And most important, I refer you back to what Nehemiah said. Nehemiah didn't only say to have a feast. What else did Nehemiah say to do?
Don't be sad.
Don't be sad. And what else? Let's go back to source 13. What else did he say to do? Goes back to what Susan said in the very beginning.
Send portions to those who need it.
Bingo. Shilchu manot le'ein nachon lo. Send portions of food to those who do not have. We're supposed to engage in chesed, in kindness. As a matter of fact, we're talking about creation. Look at source number 15, which notes, and I'm not going into the textual basis of this midrash right now, other than to note that when God creates human beings, he says, Na'aseh Adam, we will create man. And all the commentators ask, what do you mean? I thought there's one God. What do you mean we will create man? And all sorts of explanations are given. The simple literal explanation of why it says we is because it's the royal we. Nonetheless, the midrash here in source number 15 says it's we because God is having a debate about creating human beings. The malachim, the angels, dispute whether to make human beings or not. Some said yes, some said no, because these angels represent God's attributes. So honesty and truth says don't create human beings, they lie. Shalom, peace, says don't create human beings, they create conflict. But chesed, kindness, as you see in source number 15, says human beings should be created because we perform acts of kindness. So the reason why we have Rosh Hashanah in the first place is because we engage in acts of kindness. That's the justification. Hang on, Susan. That's the justification for our creation. So if we're going to have a Rosh Hashanah, we should perform kindness and be with others. You have to be with others in order to do that. So here is my challenge. Rosh Hashanah is a day when we're supposed to be together, festive together, praying together, eating together, engaging in acts of kindness together. And what do you do when everybody is socially distanced? That's my problem. Sorry, Marilyn, what?
I'm sorry, there are lots of tents being rented because that's what we're doing.
Yeah, we're renting a lot of tents. This is true. We have a big tent. Susan, what were you going to ask or comment?
Because I was going to say, the last one, before Purim, everybody does Mishloach Manot. From what you're saying, shouldn't we be doing it before Rosh Hashanah? And it's not done.
You are correct that it's something that we should be doing. I'm going to come back to that because that's one of my recommendations. But it's very interesting. Mishloach manot is the term we use, or shalach manos, right, for the Yiddishists. Is the term that we use for sending people food on Purim. That practice used to be done for every major holiday.
You have to wait.
Every major holiday had mishloach manot. We know this because the Talmud has a rule that for holidays in general, the things you're not allowed to do on Shabbat are not allowed on holidays, except acts certain acts that are of food preparation are allowed, so that you'll be able to have a Yom Tov meal, a holiday meal. But if those acts could be performed before the holiday, then you're not allowed to perform them on the holiday itself. Leading the sages to ask, why am I allowed to carry things on the holiday? I'm allowed, I don't need an Eruv. I'm allowed to carry the things I need on the holiday, even without an Eruv. Why? I could have just brought my stuff yesterday. And the answer is, as explained by Maimonides and then by Rabbi Avram Ibn Daud commenting on Maimonides, it's to enable us to be able to get food properly on the holidays, as well as to give food to others on holidays. The rabbis did not prohibit transport on the holidays because they wanted to make sure that people would be able to deliver food on the holiday itself, when it's fresh, when it's nice. So they were still doing this sending of food. Moish writes in the chat that people still do it. So there you go. But absolutely, the idea of sending food to others, Mishloach Manot, was not new with Purim. When it was decreed at Purim time, send gifts of food on Purim, they were borrowing this practice from Rosh Hashanah, from Pesach, from Shavuos, from Sukkot, of sending food to each other. Okay, so here's my problem. Social distancing completely destroys all of these communal aspects of Rosh Hashanah, right? Remember where we've been. We first talked about how Rosh Hashanah can be a day for distancing. It's a solo judgment. It's self-examination. It's minimal frivolity and lightheadedness, or lightheartedness. Even some even fasted, but then we noted also the history of human beings being with God alone on Rosh Hashanah, and the stories from the Torah reading, which are about solo people in God. Nonetheless, it's supposed to be a festive day of communal prayer, day of communal feasting, and a day of chesed, of kindness. So how do we accomplish that this year? So I want to make some practical suggestions. Number one, in terms of prayer, I'm sorry, I'm not a fan of the Zoom option for services. That's its own discussion of Jewish law for another time. I'm not going into that right now. But here's what I would suggest. Writing up a list of people you know and their needs, to bring them into your prayer. Frankly, this is something I do anyway, annually. But I think it's a good thing for people to take on. In other words, all the people you would see, you would be with, but you can't be with this Rosh Hashanah, make up a list, and in the course of your prayers, make time to think of them and what their needs are. And I think that that's a way to have them as part of the prayer, even if you can't be with them communally. You can't get together with the people you would have gotten together with. Sorry, Ruchama, what?
But how does it help them?
So it helps them, number one, in terms of praying for others is actually effective in Judaism. We're big believers in the idea that you can pray on somebody else's behalf. We do it all the time, right? Mishe Berach Lecholim is an obvious example, but there are many, many, many others. That's number one. But number two, if you are thinking about them and they are thinking about you, because this is something that has to be done, collectively, it sends a very strong message of Imo Anochi B'tzara. I'm with you now. Even if I can't be with you physically, I am still thinking about you. You are still thinking about me. We're in each other's hearts during this time. And so I think it's a valuable thing to do. Looking ahead to Sukkot, by the way, one of the suggestions that I've been playing around with is that people should hang in their sukkah pictures of the people they would be together with. So at least they're there with you in the sukkah. But that's a separate thing. Sukkot is in its own day. But that's number one. Number two, when it comes to eating, I had a thought. If you have people who normally would be with you, who would normally be with you for the holiday and sharing your meal, maybe share some recipes with them, and each one can prepare the other one's recipes, so you have their food with you at the table. So if they normally make this, sweet fish or whatever it is, they have a certain salad they make, you have them with you at the table. I'll also make another suggestion. I'm running low on time, but I want to make sure to suggest this. Foods with a message. You know that we eat foods that have particular messages on Rosh Hashanah night. Sweet foods to have a sweet year and so on. So you're able to, I'm gonna mute everybody just because I want to make sure to get everything in the last 4 minutes. You're able to innovate and add foods for that. So my favorite example of this always is the one I heard as a kid about people who get together for Rosh Hashanah and they have a piece of lettuce, a raisin cut in two, and a stalk of celery. And the message is, let us have a raisin celery. That's the idea. Let us have a raisin celery. So you can do that. And if you share that with others who normally would be with you at your table, you will again be able to be sharing something at the meal. And then chesed, kindness. So first of all, with masks and social distancing, have prearranged outdoor visits to people who are stuck at home or people who can't get together with their family. Arrange it beforehand. Make sure to do it safely, 100%. Sandy Fraley writes in the chat, social distancing is an act of kindness at this time. It helps prevent the spread of COVID-19. 100% true. But if you can visit somebody safely and brighten their day, that's of tremendous, tremendous value. Making Rosh Hashanah cards in advance and hand delivering them to mailboxes on Rosh Hashanah. Don't seal the envelope because we're really not supposed to tear things open. It can be done. I'm not getting into the Jewish law discussion, but don't seal the envelope. But if you bring a Rosh Hashanah card to somebody on Rosh Hashanah, most years, the Rosh Hashanah emails come flooding in before Rosh Hashanah and all the e-cards, and it's nice to make donations to organizations, and that's all a good thing. But if you can hand deliver some Rosh Hashanah cards, you can really brighten somebody's Rosh Hashanah. And learning Torah about chesed, about kindness. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs has a great book, To Heal a Fractured World. But there are loads and loads of books about kindness that people maybe could use some of their time on Rosh Hashanah to think through. So there are things we can do to bring about a social aspect, even if we can't be together with others. I gave you review questions at the end. Why is a day of judgment appropriate for distancing? So it's because we are assessed and judged individually, and we respond to our judgment as individuals. In individual prayer, in self-analysis, in the serious activities of the day. We also said Rosh Hashanah is appropriate for distancing because it's the anniversary of creation when human beings were alone with God. You didn't have a whole community. And the models in the Torah reading are solo models, Sarah, Hagar, the binding of Isaac, and Chana. Rosh Hashanah, though, is still a day for gathering together. It has that festivity. It has the feasting. It has the communal prayer and the theme of chesed, of kindness for others. But there are things that we can do for others and things that we can do to defy distancing, whether that's praying on behalf of others and thinking of them and what they need, sharing ideas for these message foods, preparing their recipes, visiting in a safe way those who are without friends and family, hand delivering Rosh Hashanah cards prepared safely as well, and also learning about chesed, about kindness. I think that all of these are ways in which we can overcome the social distancing associated with what's happening this year. And next week, remember, tune in again. We'll talk about Yom Kippur and why social distancing is actually really good for Yom Kippur. No surprise, we'll see both sides of it there. And I look forward to discussing that. I'm going to stay on for a bit if people want to talk a little bit further. But thank you very, very much. And anyone who's not registered, you can go to the website to register. Thank you. Feel free to unmute, comment, and all that. Thank you. I'm going to turn off the recording also at this point.